my lovely little gemstones, it's Saphira, and today I'm going to be reading A Game of Vice, Chapter 6, written by Coconut Cluster. Chapter 6, Ever After. Since 2 o'clock this afternoon, Virgil had dealt with a razor-filled river that may or may not have claimed lives before and nearly claimed theirs. Eyeless birds, vultures, or some other thing created solely from the deep recesses of Remus's grotesque imagination. A path that was almost definitely covered in skeletal remains of God knows what, and, arguably the worst of all, Remus's ridiculous antics, from hanging on tree branches to pricking people with thorns, all just to get to Roman. If he had to climb a tower to finish it off, then by God, he'd climb a fucking tower. Sure, the rain wasn't exactly on his side there. The minute he'd reached the base of the building, he realized the storm had probably been an intentional obstacle, something Remus had kept under his belt since they arrived in his own personal hellscape. The lightning and thunder didn't bother Virgil that much, though he wasn't eager at the possibility of getting burnt to a crisp 30 feet in the air, but the rain itself had already drenched the jutting stones, slicking them down into something that wouldn't be optimal for free climbing. Too bad he didn't grab Deceit's gloves before he stalked off. They might have actually saved his hands from getting torn up. He spared a glance over his shoulder, but he couldn't see Deceit or Remus through the trees, couldn't hear their antics over the thunderstorm. Too late for hindsight regrets now, anyways, he supposed. He grabbed the first stone and got climbing. He'd never been too afraid of heights. At least, not among everything else he had to be afraid of. Cautious of, he corrected, because he was more wary than cowardly, thanks. But he definitely wasn't fond of them, for good reason, what with the whole falling to your death ultimatum and all. And yeah, climbing a tower in the middle of a thunderstorm with no safety net or harness was pretty much the exact opposite of anything he'd ever dream of, let alone do, but, no, actually, he had no rationalization for that. It was insane, and he was doing it purely out of spite and possibly reckless determination. He did manage to chuckle to himself as he pushed up to the next few feet of stones, though. Roman will get a kick out of this when I tell him. An uncomfortable feeling settled in his stomach at the thought of the prince. On one hand, he was ecstatic to finally be so close to seeing him again, to save him, obviously, because Roman being in trouble wasn't the natural order of things, and they were friends and all that. But on the other hand, if Roman wasn't okay, or if he wasn't even up there at all, would Remus take it that far? Lead them on a wild goose chase just to laugh at the end? Virgil was inclined to say yes, so he tried not to answer at all instead. Then he wasn't sure what he'd do. He didn't want to think about Roman not being okay. Not in general, and especially not now. A crack of thunder made him flinch, and he dug his fingers into the stone he had a hold on, closing his eyes for just a second to take a steadying breath. He didn't dare look down, so he blinked the rain from his vision and kept moving up. For once, as he scrambled from jagged foothold to foothold, he was all too glad to be anxiety. His body was shaky with adrenaline, but oddly enough, it felt more like energy now, like a spry motivation carrying him up the stones instead of fear or anxiety keeping him grounded. He kind of liked it. It made his heart beat fast and his head spin a little in a way that felt rejuvenating, exciting even. Maybe it was just a second wind after the exhaustion of his travels. He didn't know, but he wasn't going to question it too much. What if it out of him before it got him to the window in Roman? Another flinch with a flash of lightning above, and he felt a stray edge nick his fingertip. His thoughts kept flitting back to Roman, and it was, admittedly, distracting him. Focus, Virgil. Focus, focus, focus. A glance up through the rain told him he had about 150 feet left to go. Woohoo. The gravelly handholds had already started digging deep into his fingers, though he supposed that was better than no hold at all, and his boots seemed surprisingly well suited for gripping the stones. If they had been just a little smoother, a little more aesthetic than practical, then there was no doubt he'd had slipped by now, plummeted down to the uneven ground at the base of the tower, and then the others would come and find him sprawled out and mangled. Actually, maybe thinking about Roman was the way to go. Roman, he repeated to himself, hoping to bring forth some good memories to carry him through the climb. Roman, Princely, Romano, come on, brain, give me something good. The first thing that came to him was a moment from a few months ago, right around Christmas. He remembered the warm glow of lights that Patton had strung around the living room. They'd been fuzzy in Virgil's vision, blurring with his lack of sleep as he curled up on the couch and sort of watched the Tangerine Bear, his eyelids drooping and face half buried in a fuzzy blanket, and the lingering smell of gingerbread and hot cocoa filling his head with a cozy and welcome comfort. He hadn't slept in 3 days. He had a leftover anxiety around holidays, a remnant from when he'd holed himself up in his room every Christmas to avoid the nightmarish antics of the dark sides, and later to escape the awkward smiles and forced hospitality of the light sides as they tried to welcome him into their family. It was late at night, so he was the only one up, watching the nostalgic animation of Tangerine Bear on mute so as not to bother the others while they tried to sleep. He had resigned himself to another night of sleep-deprived disassociation when he heard a voice on the stairs. "What are you still doing up?" He looked up, found Roman leaning on the railing with a crooked half-smile on his face, almost distracting Virgil from the dark circles under his eyes. Almost. "Watching a movie?" He squinted and tried to study the exhaustion on the prince's face, gauge how long it had been since he'd gotten a full night's rest. "Why are you up?" Roman craned his neck to see what movie he was watching. Didn't answer his question. Whatever. Virgil was too exhausted to push it, and lit up, shuffling down the stairs in his ridiculous crown emblem pajamas to settle on the couch beside Virgil. He didn't say much, but he gave a contented sigh as his eyes grazed the screen, ever the movie romantic, and glanced at Virgil a moment later, gaze flickering over his face for a moment. And then there was a mug in Virgil's hand. It was black and spotted, with silvery snowflakes and filled with hot chocolate, a dark counterpart to the white mug in Roman's hand, covered in gold ornaments and filled with amber cider. The smell of chocolate and cinnamon drifted to Virgil's nose, his eyes closing on instinct to take it in. He heard Roman give a small snicker at his side. "Jerk," Virgil muttered under his breath, without any real malice. "Maybe I wanted to stay up and watch the movie. Maybe you should drink your hot chocolate and sleep instead." And though his mind had been reeling with worries until he just felt numb for the past 3 days, he gave a tiredly indignant grunt and took a sip of the cocoa. He felt the warmth travel down his throat and spread through his body, a perfect companion to the twinkling Christmas lights and gingerbread and fuzzy blanket that shifted as he did. He didn't remember much after that, only that he woke up with his head resting on Roman's shoulder as the prince snored softly, and when Virgil lifted it to glance around, he saw the lights covering Roman's serene face a warm gold, and his heart stuttered in his chest as he closed his eyes and slept a little longer beside the prince. The rain fell harder around him. He grit his teeth and kept climbing. Roman had this one smile, a crooked grin. Most of his smiles were crooked, an imperfection that endeared him more than augmented, that lit up his whole face and made a single dimple whittle itself into his cheek, and sometimes, when whatever made him happy was funny or good enough, his nose scrunched up with it, giving him a youthful glow that seemed contagious. The last time Patton had suggested a family baking day, Virgil had been stuck with Roman as Patton showed Logan how to mix cookie dough with love, which inevitably brought a pale blush to the logical side's face, though it probably didn't help that Patton had slipped an arm around his waist to crowd closer to the bowl on the counter. It was back when Roman still seemed unsure of whether or not to trust Virgil, accepting but wary of the anxious side's role in Thomas's life, so their interactions around the mindscape were awkward at best, stunted and silent at worst. Virgil was doing his best to be a shadow of the problem that day. He let Roman take the lead, resorting himself to be an ingredient fetcher and instruction reader, but, of course, he managed to mess it up. He'd meant to hand Roman a cup of flour, but he turned around too fast without paying attention to the fact that the prince had stepped closer to grab it more easily, and lo and behold, the entire cup managed to find its way onto the front of Roman's sweatshirt. Virgil froze then. He felt his heart drop to his feet, felt heat rush to his face as he mumbled a half-frantic apology and stumbled to find a way out of the situation with the least amount of added humiliation. In that moment, all he wanted to do was sink into his hoodie and huddle into a corner until everyone forgot he existed, and then there was flour on his nose. He stumbled back a step, blinking owlishly at the white puff floating in the air before him. Slowly it faded, revealing a snickering Roman, his eyes sparkling with amusement that lacked any indignation or annoyance. Virgil brushed a fingertip across his nose, saw it come back dusted with white, and quickly connected the dots. "You have something on your face," Roman informed him proudly. So, naturally, Virgil threw a handful of flour at him. It was a mere 5-minute battle that left half the kitchen covered in flour and cocoa powder, and ended with a very disgruntled Patton and Logan, who immediately shifted into parent mode when they finally wrangled the ingredient containers away from Roman and Virgil, who were, as one would expect, practically buried beneath the weapons of their war. Patton made them go outside to shake the powders off their clothes before they trailed it around the house. "I just vacuumed," he told them, hands on his hips as Logan shooed them onto the porch. "And if I have to again, I'm going to ban you two from the kitchen indefinitely." And they were still laughing as they brushed flour onto the lawn. Virgil glanced up, remnants of reckless joy shining inside him, and froze all over again. Roman's hair was messy, falling onto his forehead and dusted with white even as he tried to shake it out. Virgil hadn't really noticed before, but at some point he'd pushed the sleeves of his sweatshirt up to his elbows. But most of all, best of all, Virgil had thought to himself at the time, his face was bright with that smile, a crooked masterpiece that seemed a perfect foreground against the flaming sunset, oranges and reds and yellows melding together behind him as he laughed and swiped at the flour on his clothes. His smile was golden, and Virgil was screwed. Another peal of thunder, and he was just over halfway. The stones were slick beneath his fingers now, leaving indents in his fingertips that he hoped were enough to keep his grip. Halfway there. Virgil had only been to the imagination twice. Well, 3 times if you counted the Mind Palace, and 4 if you counted now, though he was reluctant to do so. The first was just after he and Patton had started getting along, when the moral side had dragged him on some family picnic that was ridiculously uncomfortable the entire time because Virgil and Roman outright refused to acknowledge each other. Looking back, Virgil conceded that he had plenty of reasons to dislike the prince. He was loud and conceited and didn't bother to understand or even consider Virgil's job. Not to mention all the insults. Not that Virgil didn't return them, but admittedly, it was none of those reasons that garnered his contempt, at least not by themselves. Roman was dramatic, temperamental, fervent, and all Virgil saw in that was another Remus. The second time, months later, he stumbled in purely on accident. It had been a night filled with weird dreams of abstract terrors and hearts beating too fast and voices crowding in on him, too loud in his ear and resonating in his bones until he woke up in a cold sweat and unshakable daze. He decided, the minute he glanced around his room, that he couldn't stand to be there. Rolling out of bed in clumsy, sleep-drunk limbs, he shambled out of his bedroom and went blindly down the hall, no destination in mind as he tried in vain to blink the fatigue from his eyes. When his hand fell on a doorknob, it didn't occur to him that he had gone in the opposite direction of the stairs in the living room, where he could have collapsed on the couch or gone to the kitchen for a drink to keep him awake. He just turned the knob and walked through. It wasn't until a leaf smacked him in the face that he realized where he was. The recognition of Lily's scent in the air and the deep croak of frogs hit him all at once, almost as hard as that leaf. And with a start, he glanced around to find the imagination thick with twisting trees, covered in a pretty purple-pink flower Virgil didn't know the name of, dense shrubs, and large-leafed plants, like the ones that hit him in the face, which he was irrationally bitter about in his exhausted state. It was wild and untamed and startlingly different from the neat rolling hills he'd seen on the family picnic. And it was infinitely more beautiful. He'd thought something like that, just a lot less eloquent. He heard the distant sound of gurgling water, so he headed towards it without much thought. After only a few minutes of ducking under more leaves and watching his steps to avoid any frogs, he found its source, a tiered brook, stretching on past what Virgil could see, dotted with moss-covered rocks and rushing gently down the gradual slope of the forest floor, the apparent congregation site for most of the frogs he'd heard. He walked beside it for a while, content in its quiet chatter and comforted by the fact that he could just follow it back the other way if he got lost. Eventually, it fell into a middy waterfall and tumbled into a pond. Virgil caught glimpses of gray-spotted koi fish darting just under the surface and hiding beneath the lily pads floating above them. And there, sitting on the water's edge with his shoulders hunched and eyes staring straight into the pond like he couldn't bother to lift his head, was Roman. Virgil wasn't really surprised to see him there or anything, since it was his domain. It was just that he looked sad? And, well, Virgil couldn't really name it, but he looked broken down. Virgil stood at the top of the waterfall for a few minutes, watching the grim prince until he realized that was, really creepy, and he stepped back into the trees to find his way through them into the pond. There was a thin, almost imperceptible foot-worn path down the hill that he just managed not to tumble down. He skidded off its end and into the clearing around the pond, with Roman looking directly at him. They stared at each other in silence for a moment. "What are you doing here?" the prince said finally, his eyebrows drawn and shoulders squared, ready to fight as if Virgil would come all this way just to deck him. Virgil swallowed, cleared his throat. What was he doing here? "I couldn't sleep," he offered lamely. "I was just kind of walking and not paying attention, so I ended up in the imagination, and then I followed the brook." He gestured to the little waterfall, as if Roman didn't know what he was talking about, and cleared his throat again as the prince just blinked at him. "What are you doing here?" Roman blinked again and raised an eyebrow. "I made here." Virgil suppressed the urge to roll his eyes, forcing a deep breath filled with lilies, and crossed his arms over his chest. "I know that. I meant, what are you doing here at early as shit o'clock?" And Roman just stared at him, mouth a taut line and eyes filled with an exhaustion, fatigue different than Virgil's, but with circles just as dark. He didn't say anything as he tipped his head down, inviting the anxious side to sit down on a nearby rock. Virgil hesitantly but ultimately accepted. As he settled onto the stone, one of the only ones not covered in fuzzy moss, Roman gave a small sigh, turning his eyes back to the water. Virgil could clearly see the prince's reflection in the pond water, tinted blue and turned to ripples as a koi fish broke the surface and dipped right back down again. Virgil's eyes didn't tear from the water. "I couldn't sleep either," he told Virgil quietly. Virgil remembered thinking, with a twinge of guilt, that he'd never heard Roman speak quietly before then. Virgil tried a playful smile that came out more awkward. "So, no beauty sleep tonight?" Roman, at the very least, gave him a joyless chuckle and shrugged. "Not tonight, I suppose. Or last night, or the night before. His face was drawn suddenly, still focused on the pond's surface. Thoughts move too quickly sometimes. It's fine if they're ideas or dreams. But, another shrug, but sometimes they're more bothersome than whimsical. Virgil didn't know what that meant, so he just looked into the water too, eyes tracing the lily pads with idle interest. The forest had its own choir as he listened. The babble of the stream, frogs still croaking, those pretty flowers rustling in a breeze he hadn't noticed before. It was nice. Calm. He liked it much better than the rolling hills and stuffy old picnic. How was Remus? Roman asked suddenly, his voice odd. When you left them, I mean. How was he doing? And then it was Virgil's turn to blink. Have you not talked to him? Roman flinched, barely, so slight that Virgil might not have noticed if his entire existence wasn't built on vigilance, and looked away from the water at last, turning his gaze to a cluster of purple petals that had fallen from the trees. Not really, he said. We don't get along well nowadays. A bit too different, I suppose. He grabbed a petal and stared at it for a moment before crushing it between his fingertips. Maybe a bit too similar. Virgil watched him silently, eyebrows knit and gaze narrowed, pretending he hadn't thought that very thing since he first met Roman, a sinking feeling quickly settling in his stomach. What does that mean? I don't know. And Virgil could tell he meant it. We're both... He shook his head, trying to find the right words. Short-tempered, fanciful. He gave the smallest of laughs, eyes sad with a memory Virgil wasn't privy to, and shrugged again. Stubborn? Is that always bad? Roman glanced at him with surprise, as if he'd forgotten the anxious side was there. His face screwed up in confusion as he comprehended Virgil's comment. What? You're brothers, not to mention two parts of the same side. Obviously you're gonna have stuff in common. And besides, everyone has flaws. You guys just happen to have similar ones. It was supposed to be encouraging, as best as he could do, but he kind of regretted it when Roman's poised expression faltered. The prince's gaze fell sluggishly back to the water. Yes, I suppose you're right. We all have flaws, Princey, he insisted, trying to gloss over the fraternal similarity part of that pep talk. Roman just nodded along, a practiced response, rehearsed and performed with no effort now. Virgil sighed. I'm impulsive, he admitted, hugging his arms around himself. It caught Roman's attention. And snappy, and I assume the worst about a lot of stuff. Most stuff, I guess. He looked over, saw Roman quickly turn his eyes back to the pond and nod along again, though he'd leaned forward with interest. Virgil watched him tilt his head at a koi fish, who tilted its head back, watched him give a tiny, odd smile at the interaction. The sinking feeling in Virgil's stomach sank further as he turned back to the water, and finished quietly. And I judge people too soon. Roman glanced at him again, looked him over for a moment, and offered the smallest of crooked smiles. Me too. Rain blurred his vision as he climbed now. He didn't dare shut his eyes and trust blind autonomy, so he just blinked hard and kept moving, stretching for the next stone and pushing himself up and repeating over and over again with the methodic lull that he thrived on. The lightning had grown blinding as the thunder rumbled louder, closer. Virgil couldn't tell if the tower was shaking beneath his fingers or if it was just his muscles screaming for rest. He ignored it either way. If it was the tower, he could fall down the minute he left for all he cared. If it was him, well, he'd rest when he was at the top, through the window and at Roman's side, when he was certain he'd finished Remus's bullshit game once and for all. When the next stone he grabbed was a window ledge, and he was hauling himself through the opening above it. With every scream of thunder and flash of lightning pouring in through the window, deafening, blinding, Roman was more certain he was going to have a nervous breakdown. Being stuck in a chair for God knows how long was no doubt a factor, especially given his proclivity for moving all the time, not to mention those awful birds, who, he noted with the weakest triumph, had been seemingly driven away by the storm. But there was something distinct about the thunder crawling closer with every crash, the lightning moving from a distant spark to a painful flash just over the tower, that made him want to squeeze his eyes shut and curl in on himself forever. His throat ached and his eyes burned and his whole body was hurt and tired and he just wanted to go home. It was a desperate wish that seemed to gnaw at him from the inside out until his vision was blurry with tears again. He didn't even bother to blink them out or away, just let them sit there and augment the view he'd seen for hours. Remus hadn't come back yet. Roman couldn't decide if that was a good thing or not. Sure, it was nice to not have to worry about being skewered through the throat. He felt deep down that his brother would never actually kill him, but a slither of doubt wormed its way into his head, regardless. But there was something disquieting about his absence, the idea that he was off creating chaos somewhere else. His sword, however, had disappeared at one point, shimmered away where it had been sitting after he tossed it to the side in rage or mania or whatever he was feeling at the time. Roman couldn't tell, just as the rain started to fall. It didn't bode well in the prince's heart that Remus suddenly decided he needed a weapon, wherever he was. Nonetheless, Roman kept his blurry gaze trained on the window, the spot that Remus seemed to favor reappearing in, vigilant as he could be in his current state, which is how he was sure he was going crazy. Because there, at the window ledge, suddenly and startlingly in tandem with another flash of lightning, was a hand. Not a whole hand or anything. Roman wouldn't put it past his brother to scatter disembodied limbs around to freak him out, though, but fingers curled around the outer edge of the stone ledge, holding on for dear life. And then there was another, a clear clue that whatever had climbed the tower was human, or at least humanoid. Roman eyed the debacle warily, trying in vain to shrink further into his seat, distance himself from whatever torment Remus had sent his way, resorting finally to squeezing his eyes shut. No shame left when he felt the warm tracks of tears on his face. He was too tired for this, too worn down. Another bolt of lightning pierced the black, and it was too much. It was all too much now. Roman! His eyes flew open. Before his vision could even focus, he knew who that voice belonged to. The painful hollow that had carved himself into him since he'd been stuck in the tower filled instantly with something warm, something alive, because that voice belonged to blueberries over the breakfast table, and Disney marathons, and snarky advice, and midnight hot chocolates, and debates about Grimm's fairy tales, and home, and comfort, and contentment, and everything that made Roman's heart skip a beat in his chest. That voice belonged to Virgil, the most antithetical beacon of light, stumbling through the window. "Roman," the anxious-eyed repeated with a grin as he pushed himself through the window and tumbled to the floor onto his knees. He was shaking and soaking wet, hair stuck to his forehead, eyeshadow running down his face like tears, but that smile was so bright and elated that all Roman could think was an exultant, "Thank God. You're here!" Roman managed half a smile behind his gag. Where else would I be? The joy on Virgil's face faded almost instantly, though, as he finally looked around the tower and took it in. His eyes landed on Roman again, and the flicker of the confusion in his eyes turned darker as they grazed the ropes, his smile melting into a tight frown. He hauled himself to his feet, at the prince's side in an instant to cut his restraint with the sword from the hilt at his side. If he noticed Roman's flinch as he drew the blade, he didn't comment, and it was then that Roman noticed his outfit. Chainmail and scant armor, and a length of purple fabric over his shoulders and down his back like a cape. Won't it be oh so sweet to be rescued by a dashing knight? Roman inwardly breathed a disbelieving laugh. At least Remus kept his word. "I'm sorry it took us so long," Virgil said at his side, voice uneven, like he was trying to hold back a flood of emotion and just barely succeeding. He finished cutting the ropes at Roman's wrists, and immediately the prince's hands flew to tear at the knot of that godforsaken gag, eager to speak, or at least get an actual breath in for the first time in hours. But his wrists were shaking and fingers clumsy. Virgil quickly stepped behind him and untangled it for him. The instant he could breathe, his lungs filled with fire. He broke into a coughing fit, doubling over in the chair. It hurt, tore at his throat and burnt in his chest, but he could breathe, and good God, he was willing to take anything he could get right now. He didn't know when it happened, but suddenly he was kneeling on the floor, Virgil's arm around his waist and his around the anxious-eyed shoulders as he forced a few even breaths. Finally, hoarsely, he managed with the weakest of smiles, "Hey, stormy night." Virgil stared at him with wide eyes, a storm blazing in his gaze, but as he scanned Roman's face, his lips finally quirked into a tiny smile. "Hey, Princey." His arm curled tighter around Roman's waist, like he was afraid to let go. Roman wasn't complaining, even if Virgil's clothes were cold and dripping wet, and he pressed his lips together tightly when his gaze landed on the cut across the prince's cheek. "What happened?" he asked carefully, eyebrows furrowed as he brought his free hand up to inspect it. His fingertips were cool on Roman's skin, sending a shiver down his spine. "Remus wasn't in the mood for humming, I guess." He tried to laugh, though it came out more choked than he intended. Virgil didn't respond. He looked down, found Roman's other hand and took it in his own. His grip was gentle, and without warning, tears sprang back into the prince's eyes, and he honestly wanted nothing more than to lace his fingers with Virgil's and hold on until he felt normal, until he felt okay again. But the anxious side was focused on the abrasion on Roman's wrists, his eyebrows drawn together and teeth gritted. Roman hadn't actually seen the rope's damage yet. He glanced down, following Virgil's gaze, and expected to feel vindicated at the evidence of the restraint's unnecessary harshness. Something to wave in his brother's face and claim outrage when he saw him again, as if he felt anything close to anger in that moment. When he glanced down, though, all he felt was horribly sick. His stomach twisted, head light and spinning as he stared at the angry red lines across his wrists, spotted with blood and the early splotches of bruises just beginning to form in ugly shades of red turning purple. It was hardly evidence, he knew with a thick swallow. It was just a reminder. "I know this is a stupid question," Virgil said lowly, his hand still holding Roman's as he looked up to meet his eyes. "But are you okay?" Roman just turned his gaze to a spot on the floor, scored with white, scraggly lines by Remus's sword. He forced down a shiver that threatened to shake him at the memory of that awful scraping noise. A crash of thunder outside made him flinch regardless. "I don't know." He was elated to see Virgil again, to know that he'd been in the anxious side's mind, all of the others' minds, he guessed, from Virgil's use of "we," while a sitting duck in this godforsaken tower. But another part of him, just below the surface, twisted itself in knots, because Remus was right. The others did care about him. They had come for him, and for some reason, all that part of him felt about it was guilty. He felt Virgil's eyes on him, flitting across his downturned face with that thoughtful frown of his. And then, as if he could read Roman's mind, he squeezed his hand once and said quietly, "You know this isn't your fault, right?" And Roman couldn't hold back admitting, "It really is." His chest hurt again. Maybe it was the sigh he heaved, or maybe it was just the full force of the situation hitting him right then and there, after the stress of waiting for Remus to return and taunt him was finally gone, and Roman felt unraveled, uncoiled, and painfully vulnerable. And he shrugged, as if this mess amounted to nothing but a simple shrug. "I pushed Remus away, you know. I was the first one to try and hide him from Thomas, and I don't know, maybe it was fear or confusion or something like that, but it doesn't excuse it." Virgil opened his mouth, but Roman jumped to finish before he could start. "He's hurt, Virg, and he deserves to be." "He hurt you," Virgil snapped, lifting Roman's wrist as proof. He dropped it when Roman just winced. "Ro," he continued a moment later, softer, "you being afraid might not excuse leaving him, but him being hurt doesn't excuse this. You've both made mistakes." He waited, vying for Roman's eyes, then sighed when the prince just curled his hand tighter in Virgil's. They both fell silent for a few minutes. A bird called out somewhere beyond the tower, a distant, hopeless cry beneath the torrent of rain and thunder, like a soul leaving its body at last. "You and Remus have never been perfect, Roman, but I know for a fact that it's not just your fault. You can't only blame yourself, or you'll tear yourself up inside. You've grown past your mistakes with him. If you're willing to try and fix them, or at least your relationship with him, doesn't that mean something?" Roman finally looked up, saw the shine of concern and earnest in Virgil's eyes as the anxious side held him tighter, like he wanted to make it certain and concrete that he was here beside him, that he was here for the prince. There were tears in Roman's eyes all over again, spilling over his face at last. He didn't answer, just took his hand from Virgil's and wrapped his arms around the anxious side's shoulders and held tight. "Thank you," he mumbled into Virgil's shoulder. Virgil gave a tiny laugh, hugging him back without hesitation, and Roman finally felt himself relax in his arms. "For what?" the anxious side asked, holding tighter when Roman flinched at another burst of thunder overhead. "Coming for me? Of course I came. And just being here, being you." "Oh." Virgil didn't speak for a moment, but Roman felt him hold his breath, then just barely heard him repeat as he held the prince tighter still. Of course." The rain poured harder outside, thunder and lightning beating against the landscape without mercy. The flapping of a solitary pair of wings echoed closer and settled to stop on the window ledge. And though he could perfectly, discomfortingly picture that sightless gaze trained on him, Roman just closed his eyes and let his senses sink into Virgil's touch. And then it wasn't raining. It took Roman a few minutes to realize the storm hadn't just faded in his mind, it had faded entirely. The cold drafts had stopped, replaced by a gentle warmth that brushed the back of his neck and made Virgil's wet clothes feel freezing in comparison, and the cacophony of thunder and birds' cries fell away to total silence, surrounding him all at once. He almost felt comforted, but if Remus suddenly decided to wipe his landscape of chaos, that couldn't be for a good reason. He was kind of right. When he finally lifted his head from Virgil's shoulder, immediately he knew they were no longer in Remus's side of the imagination at all. The first thing he saw was the couch of the mindscape living room, his golden notebook still askew on its arm. The second thing he saw when he turned around was Patton and Logan, their eyes wide as they kneeled on the ground near the stairs. Patton had a box in his hands, but Logan's hands were red, glasses slipping down his nose with nothing clean to push them back up. The third thing Roman saw was Deceit, bleeding out on the carpet. Holy shit, Virgil breathed, rushing to stand as he and Roman both scrambled to Logan's side. The anxious side went ghostly pale when he saw the blood staining Deceit's clothing. The faint splotches of red seeped into the carpet, the discarded wipes with similar scars strewn around the trio by the stairs. Roman's eyes landed instead on the green tulle sash on the bottom step, drenched in red and ripped above a hastily tied knot, and his heart fell to his feet. "I've stopped the bleeding," Logan reassured before they could start panicking anymore, though Virgil's breathing was already uneven, even as Patton leapt up and went to his side to talk to him in low, careful tones. "The wound's been sterilized." Virgil's voice was sharp and echoing as he interrupted. "Is he okay?" "He will be, Virgil. I promise." As Virgil and Logan broke into back and forth, frantic to compose to frantic again, Roman just stared. Deceit's face was blank, calm, but it was startlingly pale. His usual capelet had been replaced with a long black cape, and its inner yellow fabric was stained with deep crimson patches, quickly turning deeper as they dried. He wasn't actually bleeding out now, a conclusion that didn't make Roman feel any better. The prince's eyes flitted back to the sash tossed across the stairs, torn and abandoned. His brother was nowhere to be seen. He felt, on some rational level, that he should be relieved, but he just felt hollow. It was with dull surprise that he felt tears color his face for the third time today, as the choked feeling in his chest returned tenfold. "Oh, Roman," came Patton's soft gasp after a moment, and the living room went silent when the moral side was in front of him, searching his eyes with gleaming concern and something ineffable as tears filled his gaze too. "Is it okay to give you a hug?" Wordlessly, Roman opened his arms. Patton wrapped him in a warm, familiar embrace in an instant. "We were so worried," the moral side said, voice shaky with emotion as Roman curled his fingers in the soft fabric of his cat hoodie. "I'm so glad you're back, kiddo. I'm never letting go, just so you know," he added with a laugh that only felt a little forced, and Roman couldn't help but smile. "So you better get comfortable. We're gonna be here a while." Roman took a deep breath. Patton's clothes, as always, smelled like vanilla and sugar, like baking and home, and hugged tighter. "That's okay with me." Logan cleared his throat from where he was still kneeling beside Deceit. "Roman," he said carefully, evenly, wiping his hands clean with an almost imperceptible wince as the prince peeked over Patton's shoulder to look at him. "I'm also glad to see you're safe. I'm sorry your homecoming was, less than stellar." Roman gave a small, gracious smile and pulled him into his and Patton's hug. "Thanks, Teach." Despite the comfort of being home again, though, something still tugged at Roman's stomach, the image of his brother's sash imprinted on the inside of his eyelids. After one last minute of indulgence in their embrace, he reluctantly pulled away from Patton and Logan and took a deep breath. "Where's Remus?" Virgil shuffled up to his side, taking his hand just as he started to dig his fingernails into his palm. Patton and Logan shared a glance. "He dropped Dee off here," Patton started slowly, wringing his wrists, "and asked Logan to help him, but he disappeared after we made sure Dee wasn't bleeding anymore." He glanced at Logan again, a silent question in his gaze, and the logical side nodded. Patton gave Roman a hesitant look, something between hope and reluctance. "He said, when we see you again, to tell you he's sorry." The living room fell quiet as Roman blinked. It was Virgil who broke the silence with his laugh, a bitter, angry sound, disbelieving and sharp. Patton winced, though Logan raised his eyebrows in subtle agreement. "He's sorry?" the anxious side repeated incredulously. "That's it? Virg," Roman said quietly, and Virgil's mouth snapped shut. We should get Deceit somewhere to rest," he said, duly ignoring the furrowed frown on Patton's face, the pursed concern on Logan's, and moving instead to go to Deceit's side. He'd process the situation with his brother later. After a moment of silence behind him, Virgil walked to his side and gently nudged him aside. "I got him." It sounded more like a plea than an offer. Roman met his eyes, saw the thinly veiled desperation there, and nodded, stepping back to let him kneel down beside the snake-face side and carry him to the couch. Roman didn't know what had changed. He realized with a start that he didn't know anything about the last few hours, save for eyeless birds and pure panic, but he felt it wasn't his place to question it just yet. As Deceit's spot on the stairs sat newly vacant, the prince's gaze traveled almost involuntarily to Remus's sash again. He finally gave in and went to it. He was reluctant to touch it, though he didn't know quite why, but after a few moments of just staring at it, he slowly reached out and lifted it off the steps, eyeing the stains and tears with a mender's gaze. He wasn't sure he'd be able to get the blood out without sacrificing some of the fabric's sparkly overlay, but the rip could be sewn together with ease. Something hopeful fluttered in his chest as he folded the sash up and let it fall, shimmering away midair to wait for him in his room. He was just about to turn back to the others when a small yellow thing on the stairs caught his attention, hidden before by the sash. He bent down and peeled it from the carpet carefully, turning it over gently in his hands, studying its curled edges and well-loved material, before he finally realized what it was with a sharp intake of breath. A tissue paper crown, crumbled at its center from the grip of a triumphant dragon witch and initialed on one peak with 2 clumsy R's. A feather-light touch brushed his arm suddenly, Patton getting his attention as softly as possible, and offering a small smile when the prince met his eyes. "Do you want some hot chocolate while Logan gets you fixed up, kiddo?" Roman glanced at the crown again, fingertips tracing the initials once over. Red and green crayon, layered gently again and again to make sure the paper didn't tear, before he let it fall to his room with the sash. "I'd love some," he answered, turning to face the rest of the living room again. Virgil met his eyes over Patton's shoulder from where he was perched on the arm of the couch, giving him a half-smile that said, "It'll be okay." He wasn't sure how certain they could be about that. The hollow in his chest had yet to disappear, a lingering anticipation of fear that had yet to fade, and Deceit was far from all right, not to mention whatever the others had gone through on their way to rescue him. But as they settled on the bottom step, taking in the smell of chocolate and the quiet chatter with exhausted relief, he saw no harm in hoping. Thank you all so much for listening. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to make sure you don't miss the rest of this series. If you like the fic, the link is in the description below, and you can check out the other videos on my channel if you like to hear more of my voice. See you next time!